Story recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a sci-fi film called Altered States. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. In the late 1960s, Dr. Eddie Jessup began conducting sensory deprivation experiments in an effort to unlock different states of consciousness. After performing the tests on 23 students, he decides to volunteer and enter the sensory deprivation tank. Eddie spends nearly 5 hours inside the tank before asking his colleague, Arthur, to let him out so he could take a look at the EDOT for example tracings. He discloses that he experienced intense hallucinations during his time inside the tank. Eddie is not particularly religious, but most of the visions he experienced came from the Book of Revelation. Arthur notes that Eddie was crying at one point because he was revisiting his father's death. Eddie tells Arthur that he'd like to try the experiment again soon, even though they still don't know what to look for. He notes that they won't be asking for a grant from the university because they're only going to conduct the studies to satisfy their curiosity. During a party at Arthur's home, Eddie meets Emily, a physical anthropologist, on her way to acquire her PhD from Columbia. Eddie immediately warms up to her because she appears to be as highly motivated and driven as he is. On the other hand, Emily finds him fascinating because of his odd theories about altered states of consciousness. After leaving the party, Eddie asks Emily to take him to her home. Emily accedes but not before warning him that they'll be confined to the living room because she has a roommate. After they make love, Eddie tells her that he had thoughts of God and the crucifixion of Jesus as they were copulating. Eddie explains that he regularly had visions of angels and Christ when he was a child. The visions only stopped at age 16, when he stopped believing in God after witnessing his father die horribly of cancer. When Eddie gets back in the sensory deprivation tank, he experiences a vision about his father at the hospital, along with religious imagery detailing the crucifixion and the sacrifice of a seven-eyed goat. A few months pass and Eddie conducts research on people with schizophrenia. Emily tells Eddie that she'll be teaching at Harvard soon, and she notes that they will be spending more time together since Eddie is also teaching there. She hints that they should get married since they've been together for a while. Eddie warns Emily that he is a bit crazy, but Emily stresses that she already knows how eccentric he is. She reiterates her proposal to get married, saying they'll deal with it if their marriage turns out to be a disaster. Eddie leaves the room without giving her an answer. After interviewing a schizophrenic patient, Eddie comes out of the room and tells Emily that he wants to get married. Eddie contends that he doesn't want to lose Emily, noting that he's unlikely to find anyone as interesting as her again if she leaves him. Emily remarks that Eddie's half-hearted proposal is the closest declaration of love she'll ever get from him. Several years later, Eddie invites Arthur and his other colleague, Mason, to his house for a party. He notifies Arthur that he'll be going to Mexico in June to meet with the Hinchi Indians, a tribe known for performing ancient Toltec rituals with sacred mushrooms. Eddie discloses that he saw a sensory deprivation tank at the medical school in Harvard. He then tells Arthur that he's interested in resuming their experiments with the isolation tank when he returns from Mexico. When Arthur sees the mess in one of the rooms at Eddie's house, his wife, Sylvia, divulges that Eddie and Emily are getting a divorce. Sylvia stresses that Eddie is the one asking for the divorce, saying that Emily still loves Eddie very much. Before they make the divorce official, Emily will be spending a year in Africa to conduct studies on apes, and she'll be their children with her. When Arthur confronts Eddie about the impending separation, Eddie explains that he's aware of Emily's feelings for him. But Eddie thinks that Emily is only hanging on to their marriage because she is afraid of being alone. He tells Arthur that he'd soon go out of his mind if he doesn't withdraw himself from the tedious rituals of life. While having a drink at a bar, Eddie starts ranting about finding immortality and the ultimate truth in the self. Mason tells him he's going crazy, but Eddie hints that he's determined to find the true self through his experiments. Soon, Eddie goes on his trip to central Mexico with his colleague, Eduardo, to meet with the Hinchi Indians. During the climb to the mountains, Eduardo reveals that the most potent ingredients used in the ceremony are the Amanita muscaria and the shrub sinichwish. The tribe regards the plant as the first flower because it conjures ancient memories. Eduardo asks the tribe leader, Brujo, what Eddie should expect when he goes through the ritual. Brujo tells them that Eddie will return to the first soul, and he'll enter a void where he'll see a spot that will turn into a crack, which is the space between nothingness. Out of the emptiness, Eddie's unborn soul will emerge. That night, Brujo takes Eddie to a cave to perform the ceremony. Brujo cuts Eddie's hand with a knife and lets the blood drip into a bowl filled with a mixture. Eddie calls out to Eduardo for help, but Eduardo just watches as Brujo continues. Brujo takes a sip of the concoction and passes it to the other tribe members as they chant. Finally, the tribe leader nods at Eddie, signaling that it's his turn to taste the mixture. After taking a sip, Eddie starts hallucinating. As the tribe dances around, Eddie sees a vision of himself with his wife sitting in a garden. A snake slithers out and wraps itself around Eddie's neck. A large lizard suddenly appears in front of him and transforms into Emily. Eddie lies down and sleeps as the dust start covering their bodies. When Eddie wakes up, he notices a mutilated lizard on the ground. Brujo tells him that he killed a lizard during his hallucinations. Eddie is furious that he didn't learn much from the ceremony, saying the natives had played a joke on him to make him look like a fool. Eddie takes home some of the concoction so he could analyze it. When he tries the mixture at the university, Eddie experiences visions of hell and some of the events described in the Book of Revelation. When Eddie passes out from the drug, Mason advises them to stop the experiment because he fears that the mixture could cause irreversible damage to Eddie's body. Arthur, however, contends that Eddie wouldn't allow anything to stop him from conducting the experiments. Mason warns Eddie that the mixture he's taking is not like LSD or any psychedelic drugs that have already been tested by other scientists. Eddie argues that the Hinchi Indians didn't suffer any debilitating effects from the mixture even though they've been drinking it regularly for centuries. Eddie further points out that he has already tried injecting the mixture into rats, and there are noticeable effects so far. Eddie takes them to the basement of the university to show them the sensory deprivation tank. Eddie tells Mason that he doesn't get any images from his hallucinations from the concoction, so he surmises that the images would show up when he drinks the mixture in conjunction with the tank. Mason, worrying that something wrong could happen to Eddie, tells them that he no longer wants to take part in the experiment. However, while Arthur is preparing Eddie for the experiment, Mason stops by, saying someone has to keep an eye on them. After shutting the doors of the tank, Eddie's hallucinations take him to grasslands where he comes across vast woodlands and newly born mountains. After a while, he witnesses the birth of the first human, not far from chimps in appearance but capable of walking upright. Soon, more of them appear, and Eddie becomes one of them. Eddie relates to his colleagues that he's killing a goat and eating its raw flesh. Mason is worried that Eddie is having a bad trip, so he opens the tank to check on him. Arthur asks Eddie if he wants to get out, but Eddie insists on going through with the experiment. Mason and Arthur are both startled when they suddenly hear a loud beastly grunt coming from the tank. Arthur asks Eddie again if he wants to stop, but he tells them to leave him alone. After spending more than 4 hours inside the tank, they finally open the hatch to bring Eddie out. But to their shock, they find him shivering with blood on his mouth. Arthur covers him with a blanket while Mason checks his mouth to see where the blood is coming from. Eddie is unable to speak, so he asks Arthur for a pen and a pad. In the notepad, Eddie asks them to take his blood and get him to an X-ray so they could take pictures of his neck before he reconstitutes. Eddie contends that his hallucination manifested into his body, but Mason thinks that Eddie is still out of his mind. Despite his skepticism, Mason agrees to put him under various tests to determine the physical effects of the drug. While Eddie is getting an X-ray, Arthur advises Mason not to tell Eddie about the blood on his mouth because he'd claim that it's the blood of the goat he ate in his vision. Mason surmises that Eddie must have had a seizure during his hallucinations and bit his lip while convulsing. As soon as Eddie gets his voice back, he asks Mason to keep anyone else from finding out about his condition, believing that he lost his voice because he regressed into an ape-like creature. Mason, however, intends to take the X-ray films to the radiology department because he wants someone reliable to assess Eddie's physical condition. When Mason shows the films to the radiologist, the doctor tells Mason that it appears to be an X-ray of a gorilla. That night, Eddie wakes up next to a female student and sees his body transforming. He suppresses his grunts, trying not to wake up the student, and goes to the bathroom. The transformation continues while Eddie is taking a shower, but everything soon returns to normal when he calms himself down. While taking notes about the experiment, he smiles, thinking that he's close to a breakthrough, but soon, the transformation starts again. A few months after the experiment, Eddie fetches Emily and their daughters from the airport to drive them to their new home. While unpacking, Emily discloses that Mason already told her about the experiments and the genetic regression he went through several months ago. She fears that Eddie may have leukemia or lymphoma, but Eddie points out that he was already subjected to several tests, and there has been no evidence of cancer. Emily notes that the results of Eddie's blood tests showed some characteristics of simian blood groups. Eddie becomes increasingly agitated as he tells Emily about his intention to return to the isolation tank. He wants to determine if the regression will happen again, but he gets furious, remembering that Mason wouldn't let him back into the lab. Eddie suspects that he entered another consciousness during his time at the tank, and the drug allowed him to externalize the primitive consciousness he encountered in the hallucination. He tells Emily that he will be repeating the experiment, so he could ask other scientists to validate the results. That night, Eddie goes to the lab and enters the tank without Arthur's supervision. Emily calls Mason and tells him that Eddie seems like he's on the verge of a breakdown. She tells Mason that she's worried about Eddie because he ranted like a madman all afternoon before he disappeared. After some time, Eddie emerges from the tank with his body totally transformed into a primitive human. Mason wakes up from his lab and hears a thud, so he goes outside to investigate. When he opens the door to the isolation tank room, an ape-like creature emerges and runs away growling. The hominid chases Mason, so he runs to the security room and tells the guard that there's a monkey on the loose in the basement. When the hominid sees them, the creature runs to the boiler room and hides in the ceiling pipes. The guard clangs on the pipes to see if anything would emerge. Soon, the hominid drops down from the pipes and attacks the guard with a baton. After hitting the guard several times in the head, the creature turns to Mason and chases him. The hominid soon catches up to Mason and hits him hard in the head while he was trying to open a door. The hominid runs out of the building as other guards chase after him. While running around the streets, he tries looking for something to eat in the garbage bins, but a pack of dogs chases him. He climbs up a building, and the dogs eventually leave except for one dog that continues chasing him. Soon, the hominid ends up in a zoo, where he encounters different animals. He drinks from a fountain and tries to grab a piece of meat from a cage, but a tiger emerges and lunges at him. As he continues wandering around the zoo, he comes across a herd of sheep. He tries climbing up a fence to run after them, but he gets electrocuted, so he climbs up a tree. When he gets to the other side, he throws a rock and hits a sheep in the head. While gnawing on the sheep, the ape-like creature grunts and growls, scaring away any other animal that might pose a threat to him. Soon, the zoo security guard arrives and sees the dead sheep. Just a few steps away, Eddie lies face down, completely naked and unconscious. Eddie is taken to jail, but he is soon released when Emily posts bail. He tells Emily that he remembers large fragments of what happened earlier that night. When they get home, Eddie narrates that he has entered a primitive consciousness, and he can only remember what made sense to him in that state. He points out that he was totally primal, and his only focus at the time was surviving and eating. Despite his primitive state, he feels like it was the most satisfying time of his life, though he worries that he might have killed someone at the university. Mason arrives and tells Eddie to report to the security office at the school because the ape that ran out of the isolation tank room almost killed a security guard. The following day, Emily takes a look at Eddie's files while listening to the tapes of his sessions at the tank. As she hears Eddie's beastly grunts, Emily starts to worry that Eddie might really be regressing. That night, Emily has bad dreams about Eddie, so she gives him a call and goes to his apartment. Emily tells Eddie that she thinks that his experiences at the tank are not limited to hallucinations. She fears that Eddie is undergoing genetic transformation, so she asks him not to try the experiments again. Eddie, however, tells her that he wants to find out if the transformation actually happened. Emily warns Eddie that he may be causing irreversible genetic damage to himself, but Eddie argues that his experiences were beyond genetics and matter. He believes that he may regress back to the first thought, and he could unlock secrets that would prompt humanity to reassess their perception of spacetime. When Emily visits the lab, Mason is already preparing Eddie to go inside the sensory deprivation tank. Eddie warns Mason that he may emerge from the tank in a primitive state, so he tells Mason to sedate him while he's still inside. After observing Eddie for more than 2 hours, Emily tells them to bring Eddie out of the tank, fearing that he might be damaging his genetic structure. Arthur points out that Eddie will be vexed if they stop the experiment too soon. Not long, Eddie starts screaming inside the tank as his body transforms. Mason tries to take him out of the tank, but he's slammed to the wall by a blast of energy. Emily tries to open the tank, but Mason stops her. Meanwhile, Arthur falls unconscious while he's staring at the light from the monitor. Mason takes Emily outside the lab, but she keeps struggling, so he knocks her out before going back inside. When Emily regains consciousness, he finds Arthur and Mason lying on the floor. From the observation room, Emily watches the tank light up as Eddie continues his transformation. Soon, the tank bursts open, leaving a whirlpool in its place. With Eddie nowhere to be found, Emily calls out to him across the vortex. Eddie rapidly regresses into the primordial cells, but before he is totally erased out of existence, Emily reaches into the whirlpool and brings him back. After getting Eddie back to his apartment, Mason tells Emily that his vital signs are good, but he'll probably sleep for a day or two due to the amount of drugs in his body. Emily expresses her frustration about falling desperately in love with Eddie despite his lack of concern for her. Emily confesses that he's tried to fall in love with other men while she was away, but she can't get Eddie out of her mind. She's dismayed that Eddie never cared about her because he's only concerned about finding the truth. As Arthur and Mason argue about the terrifying implications of the experiment, Eddie lies catatonic on the bed. Arthur points out that they've experienced an inexplicable physical phenomenon that night, and he wants to learn more. He tells Mason that he wants to repeat the experiment with other subjects, but Mason argues that they shouldn't administer the untested drug to innocent people. After Mason and Arthur leave, Eddie wakes up and sees Emily lying on the couch. He covers her with a blanket and lies down on the floor next to her. The following morning, Eddie tells Emily that she means so much to him because she saved him from total oblivion. He discloses that when he came across the moment where life began, he was terrified because he only found total emptiness. Eddie confesses that the terrifying emptiness inside him is still trying to devour him, and Emily is the only one that's keeping him together. Emily tells him to come back to the real world, but he thinks it might be too late for him. When Eddie starts experiencing transformations again, Emily tells him to fight it. Emily reaches out and grabs his hand, but Eddie's primordial energy rapidly devours her. Horrified by the thought of losing Emily, Eddie fights as hard as he can to stop the regression. When Eddie finally returns to his normal form, he embraces Emily, causing the energy that enveloped her body to dissipate. Emily smiles in sheer delight and joy when she finally hears Eddie say he loves her. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.